It's been a little while since I've done a proper history of a company type video. I've almost forgotten how to do them, which is worrying. This is already somewhat different in that we're not covering a bunch of Brits today. Instead, we've got some Americans. But they are a company that's been requested a lot and frequently, and a double bill of requests to cover two of their games kind of forced the issue. Now I could just give you separate reviews of The King of Chicago and Wins, but nah, let's push the boat out. Let's look at Cinemaware themselves. A company that dared to be different, was ahead of its time in many ways, tried to push the boundaries of gaming in an era when everything was up for grabs, and ultimately fell short. This should be interesting. Cinemaware's principal founder, Bob Jacob, got his start in the industry in 1984. A Chicago native who moved cross-country to California, he worked as an agent for companies such as Epix and Activision, selling C64 games to them. A nice, cushy way of existing, but Bob had something of a vision. He felt that games as they weren't quite cutting it, that they lacked mass appeal. The programmers who largely created games weren't exactly in touch with what the people at large wanted, and at the time this would have been an important question to ask as we headed into the North American video game crash. The inspiration for Cinemaware came from the platform that they would largely spend their whole time in the business working for, the Amiga. When Bob got his hands on an early A1000, it changed things for him. This was the machine that could make Bob's vision for games a reality. Bob Jacob himself admittedly wasn't much of a gamer, but he was something of a movie buff, and he believed that in order for computer games to have mass appeal, they needed to be like movies. They needed to tell stories, as movies did, to have character, snappy scripts, high visual fidelity. That was the key. He wasn't the only one to think this way, of course. He was following in the line of Rick Dyer, creator of Dragon's Lair. Elsewhere in California, Tom Zito was busy creating the projects that were to be the flagship of Hasbro's never-released Control vision that we know so well today. Still, Jacob's vision, at this point, didn't necessarily involve live actors or hiring Don Bluth. Jacob's cinematic spin on gaming even goes back to his pre-Cinemaware job. As an agent working as a go-between with small developers and big publishers, he fancied himself not unlike a classic Hollywood agent of old, essentially selling products. He was an entrepreneur who felt that he had a set of skills in selling that a lot of small developers lacked, even if the games themselves often didn't appeal to him. He's on record as saying that even the most story-driven games of the early days, Infocom's text adventures and what have you, did not appeal to him, but the Amiga did. A chance meeting with a prototype Amiga at the offices of Ireland, a small dev he was working on selling a paint program with, would change his career path completely. It is interesting to compare Jacob's approach with another company who took a lot of inspiration from cinema at the time, the Trip Hawkins-led Electronic Arts. EA's influence from cinema was less direct and more an aesthetic thing in that they also wished to establish themselves as a studio that would take games to a new level, through treating their own devs as celebrities and serious creators, embracing games as an art form in all areas right down to their LP-style packaging, and indeed through their very name itself. They were artists, not developers. But they did this while still utterly dedicating themselves to games as their medium, while Jacob had a more simple approach. He reasoned logically that the Amiga, with a proposed price point of $2,000, would not cater to the existing gaming market, that of teenagers. Bluntly put, the machine would be too expensive for them, or more accurately, too expensive for their parents. He wished to create games for adults, mid-30s professionals who were much likelier to buy the machine, and in terms of games would want something enriching but not overly complex or taxing that would show the system off and create an experience more in line with the movies he loved so much. Trip and Bob were after similar goals, yet the approaches were entirely different. Still, EA would create another tool that would give Cinemaware the ability to achieve their vision: good old deluxe paint. After gathering up funding from the best sources that he knew, Mormon doctors in Utah apparently, Cinemaware were officially formed in 1986, signed a distribution deal with Mindscape, and set to work on their first 4 games, with the deadline to go gold on all of them by October of the same year. Cinemaware would use various people for the creation of said games: Sculptured Software, a developer that Jacob already had bonds with through his agent job, and 2 individual talents, Doug Sharp and Bill Williams, who had cut their teeth on various games for the Atari 8-bit and the Macintosh, amongst others. While the Amiga had been Bob's main source of inspiration, he chose to hedge his bets when it came to the multitude of 68,000 based computers that were now on the market. Sculptured were to create a game inspired by medieval costume epics for the Amiga, and a Cold War inspired sci-fi thriller for the Atari ST. Doug was handling a game inspired by 1930s mobster flicks for the Macintosh, and Bill's game for the Amiga would be their take on the Ray Harryhausen style fantasy adventure. If all went well with these games, then Cinemaware could start thinking about ports. For once, all of the games that I described did end up coming out, and they are actually all important, at least in one way or another, but none more so than their first game. The first year or so of the Amiga was, if you were a fan of games, pretty thin on the ground. There just wasn't a whole lot out there that flexed the system's muscle, not much that wasn't already available on the 8-bit computers even. Bob's instinct was indeed correct. The Amiga was too expensive for the kids to flock to, and so for the first year of the machine's existence there wasn't much of a games market to speak of at all. But Bob and Cinemaware had an idea that would change all that. An epic game based on the old swashbuckling dramas of medieval England, where dashing men with moustaches took part in joust tournaments, saved fair maidens, and beat off the Norman hordes from the shores of England. Building block-wise, as an idea initially from Bob and thrashed out into detail by Kellen Beck, it was Risk but localised entirely in England, and as a game, it would become Defender of the Crown. The importance of Defender of the Crown to the Amiga as a gaming platform quite frankly cannot be overstated. This was the first true killer app that the system had. When it was demoed in September of 1986, it sent the crowds absolutely wild. It was seen as the future of games. It created the gaming market on the Amiga. It's estimated that a couple of months after its release in November, over a quarter of the Amiga's then around 100,000 strong user base had bought Defender of the Crown, and Lord knows how many others possessed pirated copies. If you add them to the mix then, perhaps 3/4 of the base had it, if not more. The game was utterly ubiquitous. Bob Jacobs' instincts had been proven right. There was indeed a market for the games that he wished to make, and in that sense Defender of the Crown was an utter triumph. But hoo boy, a gut and a half was busted to make it possible. The dev cycle for Defender of the Crown was infamously brutal. As mentioned, Cinemaware had no less than 4 68,000 based games to deliver to Mindscape by October, and outsourcing was required. One part of the equation for Defender of the Crown was one of the most talented men working on the machine, Jim Sachs. His pictures were shared on discs throughout the Amiga scene. In 1986 he was arguably the Amiga's best painter, and he was the art director on Defender of the Crown. The majority of the scenes in the game are his, and that's by far the most memorable part of the game today. The quality of the artwork was and is phenomenal. It's still an extraordinarily pretty game. The other part was taking all of this fantastic art that Jim and his team were doing and sending it to Sculptured Software, who were using it to make a game. And this was where things went badly wrong. Sculptured, who were also working on SDI for the Atari ST, were way out of their depth when confronted with the 68,000 chip. They were spread thin, and put bluntly, when Bob came to visit them in the summer, he saw that virtually nothing had been done, and we are about 4 months out from release. It's a crisis. And so Bob hires Cinemaware's first internal employee, John Cutter. Cutter, a highly important figure in the company, was in this first instance a problem solver. It was decided that Defender of the Crown would be taken off Sculptured completely, and that they would keep SDI, but under Cutter's strict supervision. Cinemaware turned to no less a figure than Robert J. McCall, one of the literal inventors and designers of the Amiga, he of the Boyne demo and designer of the Amiga's GUI, to take the art and whatever Sculptured had done, and in 3 months turn it into a working game. To be fair, it's not a bad choice, especially when they kind of understated just how much of a mess the game was at that point. McCall worked day and night, virtually 20 hours for 3 months straight to knock the game together. It nearly killed him. He was so beaten, wrecked and pissed off by the experience that ultimately he didn't even want a credit for it. Jim Sachs too, who worked equally as hard, was also a bit peeved and felt underpaid for his efforts. Without these two, there would be no Defender of the Crown. Neither man worked with the company again. The game itself, as released on the Amiga, is of course visually a total beaut. As a game itself, it's clearly unfinished and only just working. The strategy element is as basic and simple as it gets, the jousting and sword fighting minigames completely incomprehensible, and the siege catapult scene only marginally better. It's not good, at all. Crucially, however, it is a short experience. A game is only going to last an hour or so. For that time, the art is enough to carry the game through by the skin of its teeth. It gives you a certain feeling. It's pure Hollywood, of course. You enlist the help of Robin Hood, you save a fair maiden, and you even have a love scene, which needless to say became one of the principal selling points for the game, and you perform other acts of derring-do for the country. It's not history, but it sure is Hollywood. Defender of the Crown is brilliant in presentation, even if it's less so in gameplay. Some would accuse it of being all style and no substance, a criticism that would stick with Cinemaware throughout their whole history, but its importance is undeniable. And of course, the success on the Amiga meant that it got plenty of ports, almost all of which, due to having more time spent on them that wasn't a total death crunch, are better games than the Amiga original. The Atari ST version of the game is undoubtedly leagues better than the Amiga version for a start. The console version on the NES would wipe the floor with it. There were other 8-bit versions too, such as a lovingly made one for the C64, even a Spectrum version which ended up unreleased. It was most certainly a sensation no matter which platform it was on, and for all the criticism that can be levelled towards it as a game, Cinemaware would have been nothing without it. The Amiga would become an incredible gaming platform with this game as the jump-off, for better or worse. It was groundbreaking. But what of the other 3 titles that the company had in the pipeline? All the other 3 games arrived with varying degrees of success, but when it comes to sales and influence, Doug Sharp's The King of Chicago is undoubtedly second behind Defender. It is also probably my favourite Cinemaware game, a take on the adventure that's way more influential than it's often given credit for. The whole thing was created by Doug Sharp solo for the most part, although he also partnered with a screenwriter to build the story. Even the rather odd waxwork characters from the original Macintosh version were Sharp's. He created them when not working on the code, and they would be digitised from there. You play as Pinky, in a Chicago that needs a kin. The previous one, Al Capone, has just been busted for tax evasion. This is Pinky's story, and you choose his path through a whole bunch of choices. Do you whack the old man? Bribe the mayor? Treat your girlfriend nice? There's choices everywhere. Even if you end up in the chair, you can choose to be regretful or defiant. You're Pinky right to the bitter end. Some dismiss Chicago as simply an electronic choose-your-own-adventure book. However, it's a lot more complex than that. A CYOA usually has at best a couple paths to victory. They're pretty linear. There's a lot more variation here. Multiple paths and outcomes for most every choice you make, decided through a mix of all the other choices you've made, and a hint of sheer randomness. Plus, the way the game is laid out, a series of character-driven vignettes, means that win or lose, every game does feel like a story. This means that Chicago is very repeatable, unlike a lot of other Cinemaware titles. A complete playthrough may only represent as little as 20% of the game. You'll exhaust it eventually, but it will take some time. It's really quite good at creating its mood too. The dialogue feels authentic to 30s gangster movies. You can picture Cagney, Raft, Robinson. It works very well. There are faults, of course. The minigames are typically simplistic and annoying. The strategy element where you manage the crew's money feels inconsequential and is especially annoying in the Mac version where it takes the form of a long conversation. However, as is often the case, ports improve matters. The Amiga port removes the convo and replaces it with a simple sheet, while also removing the potato heads and providing beautifully crafted portraits instead. It's the ideal way to play. The game rightly sold well, and for me it's one of the best realisations of Cinemaware's ideal, better than Defender of the Crown. Sinbad and the Throne of the Falcon for the Amiga is another one-man job, that of Bill Williams. And seriously, that's not a joke. He didn't just code the game, he did the graphics, the music, the design, the lot. In some parts it looks, well, kind of dodgy. Defender of the Crown, this is not, but the Herculean effort can certainly be appreciated. The game itself is largely a series of minigames with some navigation thrown in. The minigames are of varying quality, and there's all the things that you would expect by now. Raunchy love scene, big fights against Cyclops and so on. It's not awful, although not a standout. Like all of these early Cinemaware games, the ports were better by virtue of having more people work on them with more time to spare. Don't play this on the Amiga, play this on the Atari ST, or even the C64. That said, being the original does count for something. Unless, that is, your poor old SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative, not even the not that well known Sega game, which is still way better known than this one. Cinemaware didn't release that many games, and yet this one is utterly obscure. Why? Well, bluntly put, it's terrible. This was the second game that Sculptured Software was supposed to be working on, and as previously mentioned, it turned out they were way out of their depth with coding for the 68000. They finished this one, but only under John Cutter's strict leadership, and I say finished, but that's debatable. In SDI, you pretty much do two things: a dead simple space shooter section, and then a bit of tower defense as you use your satellites to spot rogue Soviet nukes and shoot them down. That's it. There's another little shooter section where you rescue your friend on the other side, which results in the by now utterly cliched Cinemaware love scene, but that's your lot. Oddly, what's lacking from this Cinemaware game is, well, the cinema. You don't find much of those cutscenes or narrative drive here, and when the ending reveals that the whole thing was a movie, one can't help but be utterly underwhelmed. It's a bad game. I sense that a lot more was planned for it, but in the end, well, that contract had to be fulfilled. I'd say the ports of this are better, but SDI didn't travel much at all beyond the ST. An Amiga port and that's that. It's rightly left in the bin, in all honesty. And so Cinemaware had released their first 4 games, by the skin of their teeth. At least 2 of them, Defender of the Crown in particular, take a place as highly influential classics that helped put forward new design philosophies. One important thing to note about Cinemaware is that they were trying to create a workflow that was cross-platform but would essentially allow anyone to create a Cinemaware game. This is most evident on the framework that Doug Sharp created for King of Chicago, which isn't all that dissimilar to more modern things like Twine that try the same thing and essentially make it so that you don't need a coding background in order to create games. Cinemaware were trying to do this sort of thing in the 80s already, folks. Cinemaware had done their tour of the 68000 platforms, and by the end of it they had figured out where they wanted to go. And so, we moved to their second wave. Bob Jacob and company thought, perhaps correctly, that while they'd managed to achieve their goals with Mindscape, it was not without a great deal of stress, panic, and ultimately broken relationships. What they'd done was still halfway between, acting as a middleman. They worked with a publisher, but then outsourced their development. This approach, for the most part, would no longer do for Cinemaware. It was quickly decided that they needed to build a strong in-house team. They'd certainly made a bit of money from the Mindscape deal and the huge success of Defender of the Crown, so it would go back into building a highly advanced, cross-platform dev suite that, at one brief point, was the envy of just about everyone. John Cutter, Cinemaware employee number 1, and Bob Jacob's consigliere, would be rewarded for his excellent fire extinguishing abilities by receiving the keys to this particular kingdom. It was also decided that they needed to make a firm commitment to one platform in particular, which was a no-brainer. Cinemaware had even managed to have a hit on the Amiga in America, no mean feat considering the tiny user base for the machine, but already their games were becoming hugely popular in Europe, especially as they worked with, good old Mirrorsoft. Mirrorsoft don't often get credit as a big publishing house, probably thanks to how spectacularly they imploded. But the Mirrorsoft connection was a big deal, and sales for Cinemaware games sold in Europe through them quickly eclipsed all North American numbers. Anyway, the foundation of the Cinemaware ideal started with the Amiga, and for Bob Jacob, the company's future laid there too. So, we move to the definitive titles of Cinemaware's second wave. Now you may wonder why, with Cinemaware's obvious love of movies, they didn't end up doing more licensed games than they did. They only did one, which we will see in this wave. As it turned out, Cinemaware were rather iffy about the current state of licensed games. Seeing that studios were given little time and resources to churn out games based on what was to be in the cinema with rather mixed results, they decided not to be a part of that. Cinemaware were still very much catering for what they felt was an older audience, and the simple side-scrollers that most licensed games in those days wasn't compatible with that. They weren't an action studio, they needed a bit more time to make these digestible and short but highly narrative-driven games. So in the end, they decided that their dabbling with licenses would come without such strict timeframes. They would go for older products that still perhaps had some kind of name value. The first of these was, of course, the Three Stooges. We'll talk more about the game in a bit, but why Larry, Curly and Moe? A lot of it, again, came down to good old Bob. He loved the Three Stooges. All the pies, the slaps. There was a certain appeal to their classic vaudeville comedy, and Bob loved it. A lot of others at Cinemaware didn't, including John Cutter, who thought the idea was a non-starter, but Bob would get the license and push ahead with it anyway. The Three Stooges weren't exactly a big name by the late 80s, but they were recognisable. The same can't really be said for the second license they pursued, Commando Cody. This character had starred in a collection of early 50s cinematic serials by Republic that were later syndicated and shown on TV. He was a rocket man, donning a jetpack and taking on villains such as, say, an evil dictator who's taken control of the moon. Successful at the time, but incredibly obscure by the late 80s. But as it turned out, Cinemaware were actually on the edge of a zeitgeist here. Someone had decided that these B-movie darlings, the jetpack-donning rocket men, were due a revival. Unwittingly, they walked into a Hollywood shark pit. They started negotiating for the Commando Cody license thinking it would be easy pickings, only to find themselves quickly eclipsed by no less a figure than Steven Spielberg, who gobbled up the license with the aim of making a Commando Cody movie. No matter, Cinemaware then went to the licensees for a homage to those old B-movies, the Rocketeer comic strip. Unfortunately, Disney had got there first. The Rocketeer was also the reason why Spielberg never actually ended up doing anything with his Commando Cody license, and the upshot of it all was a rather humdrum and underperforming 1991 Disney movie, complete with lousy licensed game of course. And so, Cinemaware didn't have their Rocket Man license, but still, they would create their own homage with an original character, and the end result of all of this was Bob Jacobs' most favourite Cinemaware game, Rocket Ranger. The story of Rocket Ranger is not unlike those Commando Cody serials. It takes place in an alternate history where the Nazis won World War II and they rule a planet through controlling the moon. You, a US Army scientist, have taken it upon yourself to don your rocket suit and radium pistol and combat the Nazi menace single-handedly, ultimately flying to the moon and destroying their lunarium mines. And of course there's fascist aliens too. As with most Cinemaware titles, the initial idea for all of this came from Bob, and the design would be taken by others. But for him in particular, this one was a passion project, and the Cinemaware game he was by far the closest with. It is a great concept indeed. The love for the inspiration is clear in every last bit of Rocket Ranger. It's packed full of different games and sections that constantly change the experience up, it's long and beefy enough to warrant a repeat performance. In many ways, it's good. And yet it's undone by one thing, the monstrous, completely unfair difficulty. It's full of many things you absolutely have to get right to the letter. If you don't, it's an immediate game over. The ultra-harsh copy protection that runs throughout the game, where you have to use a code wheel in order to figure out the exact fuel you need to fly to a specific destination, is one factor. It helped to combat the piracy that was by this point having an impact on their game's sales, but who boy did it up the difficulty considerably. I know I often say that games are difficult, but this is one where pretty much everyone agrees. It's brutal. This difficulty was, in many ways, a response to those who'd said that Cinemaware games were too easy, and they perhaps went a bit too far in the other direction. Still, it was another hit for the company. It was certainly a game that you would probably end up spending quite a lot of time with, especially if you were to actually beat it. And how many games allow you to have a boxing match with an alien? It is a pretty crazy project to be sure. Some again may find the game's ports to be a better option. Perhaps even the NES port is a more accessible beast, although still a toughie. It is probably the best realised of all the Cinemaware NES ports though, better than Defender of the Crown, and certainly better than the next game, the Three Stooges. The best thing about the Three Stooges, really, is that intro. You know, the one that makes you think that Cinemaware have sent you the one game until Larry, Curly and Moe make their appearance and sort things out. It is one of the legit funniest jokes in gaming, and one of the best things that Cinemaware ever did. The game itself, well, it doesn't really live up to that. It's a selection of minigames that have been whipped together into a board game style, with all the antics that you would expect. Everything here is based on scenes from classic Three Stooges films. Again, it's clearly a labour of love. Even the game's manual is essentially a massive appreciation and history of the comedy trio, much more than it is, you know, a description of how to play the game. This was pretty common with Cinemaware. They loved to be flowery, and it's easy to appreciate the loving nature of their manuals in a world where physical manuals are, well, basically dead. The minigames, gameplay-wise, are variable in quality to say the least. Some of them work okay, others are awful. What is good at the very least is the presentation. Utterly immaculate, beautifully done portraits of these three comedy legends. It's a total looker, without a doubt. Even if the lengthy intros to a lot of these minigames do get old pretty bloody quickly. There are some really good things to say about it, and, well, it is a good use of the license. I mean, what else could you use a license like this for? It probably wouldn't have been any better if it had been, like, a side-scroller or something. In fact, it would have just been worse. It is memorable, at least. Larry's widow apparently loved it and even wept when Cinemaware showed it to her. And in the end, the instincts worked again. The Three Stooges was actually another seller. Some say it was even their second best-selling game, after Defender of the Crown. On balance, it was certainly a worthy excursion for what would turn out to be the only licensed game that Cinemaware would ever produce. Now, we have a few other titles to look at from the second wave before we get to the third and final one. The highlight of these being Cinemaware's quite intriguing take on the sports game, along with a couple other really quite obscure titles such as, say, Lords of the Rising Sun. This game tried to be Defender of the Crown again, only beefed up, better, and with a feudal Japan setting as you try to pacify Japan by controlling either one of the great warlords Yoshitsune and Yoritomo. There's perhaps more features here than in Defender of the Crown, and some decent music too, plus the art's not bad. It is, again, damn difficult in some parts though. Those with cracked versions will no doubt fondly remember the ninja attack parts where you die in one hit, and it does have that air of inscrutability. It's not utterly simple like Defender, but it isn't the most understandable game. In Cinemaware retrospectives, this is often put right down there with SDI. I don't think that's necessarily fair, but it isn't a highlight. However, one person is on record as having taken notice. Mike Simpson, director of Creative Assembly, used the game as inspiration for the original Shogun Total War, first game in the almighty RTS series. Even more obscure from a Cinemaware perspective perhaps, is the Crystal. This is an odd one. Truthfully, the game doesn't have an awful lot to do with them, but they did release it in America. You can actually find Cinemaware branding on quite a few titles you wouldn't expect, including the original Speedball, which was distributed in North America under their Spotlight software imprint. No doubt Speedball came from their great relationship with Mirrorsoft, although there are other odd ducks here such as Federation of Free Traders and Stormlord. Anyway, the Crystal was seen as close enough in spirit to Cinemaware's games to actually get a full release under the Cinemaware banner, complete with its famously awful North American box art. The game itself was originally developed by Fish and Chip Games, published in the UK by Addictive, and featured an introductory narration from no less a figure than the legendary astronomer and games master himself, Sir Patrick Moore. The game is undoubtedly one of the strangest concoctions a UK developer came up with in the 80s, and I can imagine that American audiences were utterly perplexed by it. It's an action-adventure sort of game where you play as a space pirate named Dancis Frake, really, who goes around planets, tries to figure out what the flow is, gets into fights, and blows up aliens in his spaceship complete with old-school wheel rudder. Most of the game is spent collecting items, solving puzzles, chatting, the usual trial and error. Some say it has a LucasArts influence, but actually it's closest in spirit and design to the classic 8-bit gargoyle adventures such as Tir Na Nog and Dundalak. The art style has a brilliant campiness to it, like gloriously cheap, televised British sci-fi, an episode of McCoy-era Doctor Who mixed with Robin of Sherwood. The game itself, alas, doesn't do that brilliant style justice. It's rather different from the usual Cinemaware fare, although I can kind of see why they'd choose to release it under their branding. But it didn't set the world on fire, that's for sure. However, there is a series of games that might be better known, their TV Sports series. Both TV Sports Football and TV Sports Basketball are pretty well known and regarded, and in some areas not even just for their fancy presentation, which, as was the Cinemaware way, tried to emulate a TV broadcast. TV Sports Football is a perfectly capable American football sim for the time. It's not quite of the level of the Madden that was to come, but it's not bad at all, and it will give you a fun little time on the gridiron. TV Sports Basketball is definitely the one I enjoy more, however. It's 1990, so pretty late in Cinemaware's life, but it really gets the presentation to a T. It's rather unique in that it completely eschews the mid-court game to go pretty much straight to a showdown in the paint every time, but despite all the Cinemaware bells and whistles, it retains a pretty fast pace because of this. I'm generally not very good at serious basketball games, but this is still a good effort indeed, and well praised at the time. Now, these two TV sports games were developed and released by Cinemaware, without a doubt. There's another that we will cover later, but if you're European, you'll be aware of two more: TV Sports Baseball and TV Sports Boxing. Both of these were released after the demise of the company, but obviously they need to be cleared up. TV Sports Baseball was a home computer port of Bo Jackson Baseball, a 1990 NES game by Beam and Data East. Mindscape handled the Amiga port in 1992, and because they'd managed to get the TV Sports name from the end of Cinemaware, more on that later of course, they used the name in Europe because of it and Cinemaware's value. TV Sports Boxing from 1991 is a similar story. This was published by Data East in the US and Mindscape in Europe, and Americans know it as ABC Wide World Sports of Boxing. Now you might think this game looks familiar for other reasons. Well, the game was developed by Malibu, who were also known as Acme Interactive. A year later, they would work with Sega and develop Evander Holyfield's Real Deal Boxing for the Mega Drive, a smoother version of the same game. Mystery solved. As for the games, well, neither are bad representations of their sport, but they're also not really Cinemaware games, so having cleared them, we can move on. It's now time to start telling the story of how Cinemaware went down, before moving to their last two, and most would say greatest, games. So there is one other thing to clear up. You know when I said that the Three Stooges was the only licensed game that Cinemaware were involved in? That was kind of a fib. There is another, and it is by far the most obscure game that they ever created. This is Disney's Cartoon Arcade, a game for, the Interactive Vision. I'm sure you're wondering just what on earth an Interactive Vision is, and I doubt I will get a chance to talk about it again on the channel, so I'm going to tell you. The Interactive Vision, or to give it its full title, the Viewmaster Interactive Vision, was a VCR game system, much like Hasbro's doomed Control Vision or the Action Max. It worked using the vertical blank interval, the brief nanosecond of time in the middle of a frame where there's a scintilla of blank space, during which, it was discovered, it was possible to place code. The system itself was 8-bit and went between the TV and VCR, allowing games to be superimposed onto video images. Cinemaware got behind the project and developed the pack-in game for the system, Disney's Cartoon Arcade, one of only 7 titles released for it. The absolute linearity of a VHS tape kinda limited the system to games like this, children's games that are about as simplistic as it gets. This weird looking system was sold for $120 and, well, obviously it sank like a stone. In fact, the 5,000 units the machine sold make it one of the worst selling consoles, in the loosest possible sense, of all time. Dave Riordan, one of the most important employees of Cinemaware's later years, said that it failed because it was marketed too much as a toy. Despite heavyweight licenses such as Disney, The Muppets, and Sesame Street, it failed. But perhaps the rather cheap and perplexing design was a factor too. It looks beyond daft, like something you'd use to keep your VCR on life support. It was clearly a dog that wasn't going to hunt, and the result certainly wasn't a success for anyone. Certainly not Cinemaware. So why on earth did Cinemaware choose to get behind this absolute dog of a system? It was, in many ways, born out of frustration. By this stage, Cinemaware were the Amiga's premier developers without a shadow of a doubt, and yet the platform was a constant source of irritation for them. Why? Well, as is often the case with bad decisions and the Amiga, the answer lies with Commodore and one of the stupidest mistakes they made when it came to the platform. Now, as we all know, one could write an entire tome on Commodore's Amiga-related mistakes. Indeed, a man by the name of Brian Bagnall has done. But one of their most egregious ones was utterly ignoring, for the longest time, the arrival of the CD-ROM. When Microsoft introduced the CD-ROM format in 1986, Amiga users were utterly beside themselves. Their platform was surely poised to take full advantage of the new format. Just imagine the Amiga's standards of graphics and sound on a format that could truly take advantage of it. A 650MB CD as opposed to a 1MB floppy disk. If Commodore had been an early adopter of the CD-ROM format for the Amiga, who knows what would have happened with the machine? It could have been an absolute game changer. And what did they do? They chose to completely ignore the format. Commodore didn't even release a CD-ROM based system, the CD-TV, until 1991, a long time after the horse had bolted. This act of sheer stupidity, a classic from the Commodore boardroom's litany of technological ignorance, was damn near criminal, a bull-headed, penny-pinching lack of respect for a clear future. And you wonder why, in the deathbed vigil, the Westchester engineers burned an effigy of Mehdi Ali and pissed on his ashes? Many people inside and outside of Commodore were no doubt frustrated by their complete and utter lack of effort, resolve, brains and so forth, and Bob Jacob was one of them. The CD-ROM format was perfect for what Cinemaware wanted to do. It was the format that they really needed to shine. One of the hard rules of Cinemaware, which they only broke once, was to stick to 2 floppy disks. They felt that endless disk swapping would destroy the immersive, interactive experience they were going for. They used the most advanced compression techniques going to get as much on those disks as they could, but they could only do so much. And so, confronted by Commodore's broken boardroom, they looked for alternatives. The premier Amiga developer wished to move away. If you wish for an example of the potential Cinemaware had on CD, take a look at the rather obscure CD-ROM version of Defender of the Crown, the second CD-ROM game ever to be released. High quality VGA pictures, an orchestral soundtrack, voice acting. This is what Cinemaware wanted, their dream. But so far, here in 1989, the CD-ROM had no mass appeal yet, and certainly not much of a user base. Only the utterly rich could afford a CD-ROM drive for their already expensive PCs, and there was no console out in the West yet to take the mantle. Cinemaware looked to Philips and the CDI, but endless delays meant that pretty soon they got bored with waiting. Ultimately, they thought that they found the answer in Japan, and made a deal over there. This was the deal that, in many ways, would end up killing the company. But we aren't going to talk about it yet. First, we have to talk about the game that, for many, is Cinemaware's greatest achievement. What you see in It Came From the Desert, in many ways, is the honing of Cinemaware's craft. Considering how much they did, it's hard to believe it all came in such a short time. Defender of the Crown was just 4 years previous to this, when they still didn't really have much of an in-house development program at all. And now, well, they were pretty high up the totem pole. Right at the time when they disintegrated, they were starting to find a consistent and very high quality as more highly talented people walked through their doors. Guys like David Riordan. Dave Riordan's career is quite interesting. He started out in the 60s and 70s as a songwriter and actually co-wrote a Billboard #1 hit, Sugarloaf's Green-Eyed Lady. After a successful songwriting career, he found himself at Lucasfilm, and from there he started working on games with Ballblazer as his first co-production. And then, after that, to Cinemaware, where he would design and direct this classic title, the ultimate Cinemaware horror B-movie, and a game where they undoubtedly got everything right. It Came From the Desert essentially brings together everything that Cinemaware had done to that point and wraps it up in one neat package. The minigames here, whether it's a knife fight with one of the residents or shooting the antennae off of giant ants, are excellent. The game is a very non-linear experience indeed that can be repeated plenty of times with all sorts of differences in the story, whether you lose or fail. And the story and narrative drive is the strongest yet. A glorious B-movie homage to the likes of Lem it may well be, but what starts out as hokey and full of humour becomes ever more panicked and terrifying as the 15 days wear on and the ant invasion becomes ever greater. While Bob Jacob had often been the ideas man for Cinemaware's games, he took a back seat to Riordan on this one. Not that he had trouble creating a game that was fully in the Cinemaware spirit. It was a lengthy and expensive one, a year's production, which was quite a dev cycle back in those days, but the story of Dr. Greg Bradley's attempts to save lizard breath from the ant colony was worth it. Even the harshest critics of Cinemaware, the ones who had always accused them of being all mouth and no trousers, mostly admitted that with this one, they'd got the mix of gameplay and narrative spot on. The game feels like the start of a new wave for the company that would have seen them get better and better as the 90s wore on. Little did anyone really know that it would end up being a part of their final flourish. But we'll get to that. Aside from a DOS version, there's a couple of other things that are worthy of mention. It Came from the Desert did get a sort of sequel, an expansion pack called It Came from the Desert 2, Antheads. This is the closest Cinemaware came to making a proper sequel in their lifetime. There were other releases such as Defender of the Crown 2 for the CD-TV, but they were basically enhanced versions of the original. Antheads uses the same assets and code as the original to tell another story in lizard breath, expanding on the possible existence of a second Queen Ant and colony, with the help of an ex-army officer named Brick, who must also try to prove that radiation can be fatal. This is the 1950s after all, and atomic bomb testers were a little ignorant of such facts back then. It's a solid companion piece to the original game. Pretty damn rare, seeing as it was only available through mail order, although there's obviously various ways of playing it nowadays. Another interesting little curio is the Mega Drive version of the game, which was supposed to be released in 1990, but never made it to the shelves. For whatever reason, Electronic Arts decided against its release. It's completely different to the original. The immersive, cinematic adventure is now a top-down shooter where you play as Buzz, a pest control worker who has the incredible ability to fashion flamethrowers, lasers, and freeway shots out of trash. You use this to save the town from the ants and save your dad, while working under a strict time limit. It is pretty challenging, but it's also very short. The game is done and dusted in literally quarter of an hour, and apparently the ROM image of the game is basically finished. In the end, well, it is something of a dumbing down of the original, isn't it? It's not all that good, and its failure to arrive isn't exactly a big loss. And lastly, well, there's another very important version of the game that we need to talk about. The version of the game that features live video. Yes, Cinemaware ultimately made the decision, as you might have expected, to hire some actors, get the cameras out, and start filming proper. They are a Los Angeles company, after all, so what would you expect? However, we need a new chapter for this version, because in a roundabout way, It Came from the Desert, despite being a great success, was also the game that helped to kill Cinemaware. How so? Let us get into the fall. The Amiga version of Desert was seen as the test one for what was to come, a Dave Riordan directed version that would use full motion video. The CD-ROM release of Defender of the Crown had also been a part of the process as a way of proving the formula. Riordan was optimistic about the possibilities of FMV, especially when it came to attracting big Hollywood names. It was 1990, we were right in the middle of the VHS boom when you could find tapes on just about anything, and Riordan said that if the commercial potential of interactive video could be proven, then the big names would come. That said, they didn't try to recruit any for this game, instead relying on a group of unknowns. Not exactly hard to find such people where they were, of course. While nothing went wrong with the shooting for the FMV as such, the crew at Cinemaware were able to direct the actors and handle the primitive green screening just fine, the simple fact remains that shooting a film like this costs money. Hiring actors, crew, sound stages and all that cost thousands of dollars every single day. By the time that shooting was finished, Cinemaware had spent a big chunk of the profits they'd made on all their games on this FMV version of It Came from the Desert, enough to put them in a financially precarious position indeed. It's not like they could sit on this, they had to get it out. Which was a big problem. By now we're in March 1990, and there still isn't much in the way of commercial options for CD-based consoles. The Philips CDI console and format, which Cinemaware had previously been banking on, was still over a year and a half away from arrival, the likes of the Mega CD and the 3DO didn't exist at all, and the arrival of CD-ROM drives into PCs was still slow. Cinemaware are in a tough position. They've made this game, but where do they put it? And then, apparently, came salvation. From Japan, in the form of NEC. It's fair to say that the TurboGrafx 16, which was already out in America by this point, hadn't exactly set the US on fire. It launched virtually in direct competition with the Sega Genesis in the States, and this 16-bit skirmish was over quickly, with NEC's system utterly routed. But they did have a potential ace up their sleeve, the CD-ROM capability. The Japanese PC Engine already had a CD-ROM drive add-on. It had been there for over a year. The TurboGrafx CD, when it launched in the West, would be the first console to take full advantage of the new format, and NEC planned to release it in August of 1990. And Cinemaware? Well, they needed something quickly. On paper, it was too good an option to pass up. Cinemaware basically went all in on the TurboGrafx CD. NEC bought 20% of the company, and they got exclusivity on the CD version of It Came From the Desert. A big deal indeed. So what happened next? You can probably guess. No, the TurboGrafx CD did not turn things around for NEC. It launched at $399 with no packing game for a start. It completely failed to make any impact against both Nintendo's crown or the resurgent Sega. By the time the Mega CD was announced, the TurboGrafx CD wasn't even seen as a competitor to it. People were probably looking more at whatever Nintendo were planning to do with Sony, or distant projects like the 3DO, or literally anything other than the CD system that was already out there because it was that much of a failure. Quite simply, the TurboGrafx CD was a bomb, and the Japanese mother base were angered enough to fire the entire team responsible for its launch and the Cinemaware deal. And what was It Came From the Desert on the TG CD in the end? It was awful. The base TG16 itself wasn't even close to being as powerful as an Amiga. It wasn't even a 68,000 based system, meaning that the game itself had to be somewhat simplified. And the FMV capabilities? Atrocious. Not even close to what Cinemaware wanted, because the system was not capable. And because take-up on the system had been so low, Cinemaware couldn't sell this game that they'd spent so much money on. Not anywhere, and not on any other system because NEC had exclusivity. Other portions of the NEC deal didn't help either, such as throwing away money on TG16 ports of TV Sports Football and TV Sports Basketball, and indeed making the one TV sports game we haven't talked about yet, TV Sports Hockey, a TurboGrafx 16 exclusive. Shockingly, considering how Cinemaware probably felt about the NEC deal by this point, the game wasn't very good. Compared to the rest of the TV sports games, let alone the usual standard of Cinemaware game, it was an absolute nothing generic sports sim. Every single thing that the company did with NEC left them in more debt, and their position, suddenly, was untenable. At the start of 1991, Cinemaware were over $1 million in the red. Bob Jacob tried desperately to find a buyer for the company, courting people both in the world of cinema, Columbia Pictures, and the world of games, Electronic Arts, but to no avail. There was no way back. The company was in its death throes. By the summer of 1991, they were liquidated. A great deal of the assets they left behind were acquired by Mirrorsoft and Mindscape. Various projects, including more TV Sports Football and a spy thriller known as The Enemy Within, disappeared into the void. After a rollercoaster 5 years in which they'd tried their damnedest to redefine gaming as everyone knew it and had come really close to doing so, Cinemaware would now fade into history. Bob Jacob and the majority of Cinemaware's key employees have no doubt in their mind that the NEC deal was the death blow for the company, that it was a terrible mistake. Even the piracy that their games were often stricken with, Cinemaware made a lot of efforts to stop their games from being pirated and suffered from it pretty hard, was not considered by Jacob as a factor in Cinemaware's demise, not nearly as much as that NEC deal. It's hard to disagree, really. The NEC deal was a great shame indeed. More than a lot of things, though, there was what turned out to be bad timing in a scene where, admittedly, the future was uncertain. Had Cinemaware waited another year to make that FMV version of Desert, things would have probably turned out okay. They could have gone with someone like Sega, or they'd have worked with Philips after all, or just gotten a better deal that wouldn't have utterly crippled the company. Anything would have been better than what ended up happening, really. A lot of Cinemaware retrospectives focus on this sudden burnout. Make no mistake, they didn't fade away. That's not what happens when you fly too close to the sun, as they did. In those 5 years, they really did take more than a few risks. Right from the beginning, in fact, that initial Mindscape deal, when they had to have 4 games ready inside of a year, that came within inches of going wrong, and if it had, we wouldn't still be talking about them today. We still remember the classic Cinemaware, even though they're long dead, for their sheer audacity. They may have been criticised a lot at the time, but they had such a strong vision for gaming's future. It wasn't necessarily a fully correct vision, but they utterly believed in it. And in the end, well, we still have one more game to cover. By the time that it was released for the Amiga in late 1990, the die was already cast. Things were so bad that realistically there was no way it was going to save the company. But that didn't mean they'd half-ass it. If Cinemaware were to die, they would do so kicking and screaming. And their final game, in the end, is as appropriate a coda for a games company as there has ever been. It is in many ways ironic that Cinemaware's final game would, in the end, be inspired more by reality and history than it would be by the movies, although naturally it didn't start out this way. Bob Jacobs' idea, which he gave to John Cutter, was to make a game based on the 1927 silent movie classic Wins, the first film to win an Academy Award for Best Picture. Wins, one of the most important films made about the First World War, is still renowned even today for the quality of its flying and dogfight scenes, performed as they were by actual World War I pilots in the same types of plane. No CGI in those days, folks. Being as it was over 60 years old then, Jacob also felt that it would be a pretty safe bet to take from the game copyright-wise. From there, however, Cutter took a different route. In his research, he found accounts and stories of the real pilots of the war, and a project that at first wasn't of great interest to him became a fascinating obsession. In particular, according to Jimmy Mayo of the Digital Antiquarian, without whose sterling work a lot of this video would have admittedly not been possible, Cutter's main inspiration was the personal diary of Mick Mannock, a British fighter ace who achieved a total of 61 victories before himself being shot down and killed in July 1918. And so, Wins quickly moved beyond the silent Hollywood inspiration. The end result is a piece-by-piece, day-by-day account of the Great War in the Skies, taking place from March 2nd, 1916 to November 10th, 1918. It is by far the longest Cinemaware game. As a day-by-day account of each of your pilot's sorties, the game features over 200 missions. It's not the most varied of games either. There's mostly dogfighting, bombing enemy camps, and strafing ground emplacements. From a strictly ludic perspective, Wins gets repetitive very quickly. And yet, more than any other Cinemaware game, it rides on the strength of a very matter-of-fact and very real narrative. Wins rightly stands as one of the most powerful war games created to this very day. The subject matter itself, the harrowing nature of the First World War, lends itself to this of course, but Wins stands as a firm, bittersweet, and respectful tribute to those magnificent men in their flying machines. Every day, every sortie is accompanied by another extract from the pilot's journal. In this way, Wins writes characters and gives life to seemingly simplistic, primitive polygons in a way that few other games have managed before or since. The journal entries vary in tone, gradually getting more depressing as the horrors of the war fully take hold, as every day the casualties continue to rise. 5 men may take off in the morning, but less and less seem to come back in the afternoon. It is very likely that from time to time you will be one of those who don't come back. It is quite easy to lose a dogfight, or fly too close to the ground, or do any manner of things which will result in your death and your quiet funeral. But the game does not end with your pilot's death. You are not taken back to the beginning. Instead, you're put in the place of another pilot, and the game carries on. Only at the war's end are you greeted with a full memorial of all your lost pilots. Quite a powerful final touch. Therefore, you don't necessarily have to excel at the gameplay to respect the truly powerful experience that Wins becomes as the war marches on, as the journal recounts the attempts by Holy Joe to keep morale up, fights in the mess hall, the slaughter unleashed on the squads by Baron von Richthofen and his flying circus. It can be a poetic, a harrowing, and even an emotional experience at times, which is appropriate. The flight sim part might be somewhat primitive, but it doesn't aim for bells and whistles. It wants feel, to emulate a pilot with naught but a rudder and a gun, and technical limitations aside, it manages to do this. And what a game to go out on. Wins is, in part, different from most other Cinemaware games. In this final flourish, there is no curtain, no screen, no actors. The Hollywood influence was there at the beginning, but was then gradually removed. And yet, it might just be the studio's greatest achievement. Taking the Cinemaware formula and applying it to reality in such a way resulted in something completely different. The Cinemaware formula may not have been the direction in which games went, but Wins and others proved its power in many ways. It stands as possibly the greatest last testament in the history of gaming, a game of such power and evocation that in these regards it's almost on its own. There's a wistfulness and drive about Cinemaware's remembrance, a true dedication to keeping their games alive, hence the revival of the name in the 2000s, or the constant passing around of its IPs to ensure that they stay alive. Some could see these games as relics of a path that was not taken, but clearly that's not the case, and these games do still have a unique power. As short as the studio's life was, that's a power that will live forever. Bye for now. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, then you could subscribe, leave comments, like, and indeed support me on Patreon. If you do, you could join this list here of awesome people whom the community would like to thank. Adam Schaefer, Alex Stocco, Alexander Jazeri, Andrew Dalton, Andy Capt, Daniel Briggs, Daniel David Taylor, Dustin Cooper, Gary Pinkett, George Newton, Grafham Blackpool, Ian Roberts, James Idd, James Loveridge, Jason Durso, Jason Goy, Jason Stevens, Jace Alexander, Josh Jensen, Lee Norris, Mark Greaves, Martin Pataki, Mike's Games Room, Morton Scarnin, Nanette McCrone, Nicholas Tristan, Olaf Albeen, Peter Jack, Peter Sidorn, Phil Taprog, Potter Margel, Pocky Southmaid, Rachel Maxwell, Romeo, Ryan Burford, Sammy Lee, Samuel Victor, Scott Coulter, Seth Robinson, Simon Gulliver, Stephen Warner, Tanya J, Yucca Operator, and Zach Roach.